What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 211. I'm the co-host Kyle Anzalone, joined today by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing today?
I'm great, Kyle. How are you?
Doing well, and as I've been talking about for about a week now, I got a big announcement on the show today, and that is we're making it official. Connor is going to be coming on as a co-host of the show, and really excited for that. And so, for now, he's just going to continue to appear on one show a week. It'll probably be the middle of the week show, although this week again we will have a fourth episode. But Connor's going to continue to come on. He's helping out with a lot of the back end stuff too, and he's not replacing Will. Will's going to continue to be on hiatus, but anytime Will's wants to come back to the show, he's going to be able to do that, and it'll just be the three of us then, and likely Connor doing a show with me a week and Will doing a separate show with me a week. And just so people know, because some people have asked, me and Will are still like the closest friends. We still talk almost every day, and he still helps out with some back end stuff for the show, and we still talk about foreign policy. And so it's not like Will's not involved whatsoever with it anymore, and I still consider him a big part of the show, even if he's not appearing on episodes. So Connor, officially welcome aboard. Really excited to have you on, and just pretty much continuing what you're doing. But as time goes on, who knows, maybe you'll be able to show up more often for shows or something like that. But welcome aboard, dude.
Thank you. It's an honor.
Yeah,
Glad
no,
to be here.
it's really exciting to have you, and for all the listeners of the show know that I talk to you every week because I really like what you got. But if anybody's like new and isn't familiar with Connor's work, go check out his archive at the Libertarian Institute. Really fantastic new writer on the scene, and getting into the foreign policy stuff that a lot of people are frankly afraid to touch. It's not the stuff we're writing at the Libertarian Institute is the kind of stuff that like they don't run on foreign policy at Reason, because we take bold stances and we really understand it. So I'm really excited about everything you're doing, not only at the show, Connor, but at the Institute. So just remind people that, me and Connor are both at the Libertarian Institute. And so check out Connor's archive at the featured article section. I think you're /Connor, right?
It's something like that. I think it's might be C Freeman, or if y'all just Google Connor Freeman writer, it'll come up right there on Google. And if you find any of my articles, just type me into the search bar at the Institute, and you can just click my name, and it'll all be right there.
Yeah, and then the show archive, as well as the news roundup that I do, is at Libertarian Institute /Kyle. Of course, you can find the video version of the show at YouTube, Odyssey, and Rumble. And then support the show, Patreon, Subscribestar, crypto information, all in the show notes page. Before we get into it, Connor, we got to thank the sponsor of the show and tell our audience about the great products at Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Promo code PEACE. Help yourself out. They had tons of great products at Paloma Verde. Lots of people got New Year's resolutions going on, Connor. Sleeping better, eating better, exercising more, and CBD can help you with most of that stuff. They got the great soft gels infused with melatonin to help you get to sleep at night. If you're working out, you haven't worked out in a while, you're gonna feel really sore after. Check out their great topicals, or try like their extracts, the high dose stuff that could really help fight inflammation and help you to feel better if you're feeling sore. So tons of great stuff to help get your new year started off on the right track at Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Help yourself out, help the show out, and get your CBD products from a great small libertarian run business. All right, Connor, let's get into the show. And we're talking first today about Israel. I guess we will have some small updates on the Iran talks, but I think we're going to focus in on more what's happening inside of Israel and the oppression faced by the Palestinians first today. So get us into what's going on here.
Absolutely. So we'll start this piece from Electronic Intifada about Hisham Abu Hawash, who at this point, the news just came out that he is going to be released from his indefinite detention, what they call administrative detention. He's been held under since October of 2020. Again, without charges and no trial. Shin Bet, which is the domestic sort of spy agency which is implicated in torture and things like that. They claim he's a member of Islamic Jihad, although they according to Haaretz and Bet Salem, the top Israeli human rights organization, they say that they haven't provided a shred of evidence backing that up, and it's created a lot of tensions. But Hisham has gone on a 140-day, about 100, maybe 141 days at this point. It ended today, but his hunger strike, as a protest to these conditions and the fact that he's being held without charges on trial. And he's a father of five from a village called, he's 40 years old, a father of five from a village called Dura near Hebron in the occupied West Bank. He had lost consciousness during the hunger strike. He lost his eyesight, his ability to speak, slipped in out of a coma, I believe I saw in some of these reports. And it sounds like, let's see. So he's, according to a group called the Palestinian Prisoners Club. They said that the occupation authorities have been committing a crime against him by refusing to respond to his call to end his arbitrary detention. And they did something strange. They started moving him around. They called this well, basically, they move people around when they do these hunger strikes. The judges, since 2015, it sounds like the high courts have allowed these things they call suspensions, where they essentially transferred him to different medical facilities. In fact, one of which they explain here that they had stalled his transfer to a civilian hospital in recent months and kept him in what's described as the grossly inadequate Romley Prison Clinic, which is nicknamed the Slaughterhouse by Palestinians who have been detained there. But they moved him now. He's in Tel Aviv at the Shamir Medical Center, and this was on December 26th because his detention was, quote, suspended. But he didn't stop his hunger strike because he says it doesn't change anything. So the way that works is they make you a prisoner in a hospital as opposed to being a prisoner in a official detention facility. So let's see. So Physicians for Human Rights Israel is quoted as saying the use of administrative detention in hospitals as detention facilities must be stopped. It says even in hospital, Abu Hawash remains a prisoner. He cannot leave the hospital. He can't return home. He can't even go to another hospital without getting permission from the Israeli government. And the only difference is that he can have family members visit him. On Monday, the Israeli authorities kicked out all reporters and other supporters from the facility. And so let's see. So basically, I got a quote from Bet Salem who said, because they the idea is that he's dangerous, so he can't be like, oh, they said a dying person can pose no danger. He has never been proven to be dangerous in the first place. By contrast, truly dangerous are government members, military officers, justices, and prison guards who imprison hundreds of Palestinians without trial. And so I'll just point out before we get to later news on him being released that it's also noted here in the article that as we're moving in now into the new year, Israel is holding 500 Palestinians in this administrative detention where they're charged, or they're not charged, but there's secret evidence held against them. They're not allowed to see in these military courts. It's without charge, no trial. And of the 4,550 Palestinians in Israeli prisons, occupation prisons right now, 160 of the prisoners are children.
And it seems like that they kind of keep them in almost like a Gitmo limbo type situation where we say you're too dangerous to be let go, but we really don't have a case to bring against you in any kind of actual fair court, at least. I guess, precisely. They'll get the kids especially to like sign a confession in a language that they don't speak in order to get them out of jail and, find the parents a few thousand shekels and then demolish their homes or something for a crime that the kids never committed. Yeah, but it's really crazy to talk about a situation, Connor, in a state that's so supported by the U.S., where they're starving. Like, if you get arrested without a charge being placed on you, you have to starve yourself to get out of prison. I mean, maybe you could compare this to like horrible like situations like Khalif Browder in the Rikers prison in the U.S. Although at least he was charged with something, even if he never got a trial for the stupid trivial charge he had. But I mean, this is happening systematically to the Palestinians in the West Bank. Just crazy levels of oppression that they're facing.
Well, you were just covering on a recent show about the Israeli intelligence agent who was like, provoking essentially kids on the internet.
Yep.
And you quoted a statistic. Was it 50% of Palestinians in the occupied territories at some point going through the some sort of detention facility?
Yeah, and I believe
men and women.
I read that was men and women, and then somewhere I read that the number for women is 25%. So I don't think there's like a 1-to-1 balance between men and women in Palestine and the West Bank, but somewhere around then, like 75%, give or take, of Palestinian men have been to prison, and so. That's why it is essentially conditioned Palestinian children that being arrested by the Israeli military is like a rite of passage. Like you're going to be in like the small percentage of people who don't dissent enough to get arrested or something like that. And yeah, that was a part of that story. So what else is going on in Israel, Connor? Or anything else on that hunger strike story?
I'll just add that he is at this point, after 141 days, his lawyer announced today. I got this report from Al Jazeera that he'll be released on February 26th. So he has ended his hunger strike. At the same time, Palestinian prisoners who are being held under this administrative detention are refusing to deal any further with the Israeli military courts, and there are still more people on hunger strikes.
Yeah.
So hopefully more attention will be brought to this story. Hamash's face was all over, or Hawash's face was all over Twitter. And free for other reasons right now, Free Palestine is trending on Twitter.
Why don't we mention that and tie that,
Sure.
in here? That might be a good time to bring it up because Hermione Granger, Emma Watson, I guess, actually, said something on Twitter that was supported of Palestine. I mean, it's not like she was like the Israelis are Palestine,
settler colonial apartheid regime.
Yeah. Thank you for finding my words there for me, Connor. But what did she say, and what's the reaction?
Well, I mean, it was interesting because she just posted a picture of a pro-Palestine protest, and it said solidarity as a verb, and then she quoted let's see, this British Australian activist named Sarah Ahmed. She goes, and the quote is actually, it's like you said, it's very, I mean, honestly, subdued. It says solidarity does not assume that our struggles are the same struggles, or that our pain is the same pain, or that our hope is for the same future. Solidarity involves commitment and work, as well as the recognition that even if we do not have the same feelings or the same lives or the same bodies, we do live on common ground. And Gilad Erdan, the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, and Danny Danon, the former Israeli ambassador to the UN, they came out. They called her an anti-Semite. Danny Danon says, he goes 10 points from Gryffindor for being an anti-Semite, and then Erdan said, fiction may work in Harry Potter, but it does not work in reality. If it did, the magic used in where he says Twitter, they both said this on Twitter. If it did, and she was on Instagram, but he goes, if it did, the magic used in the wizarding world could eliminate the evils of Hamas, which oppresses women and seeks the annihilation of Israel, and the PA, which supports terror. I would be in favor of that. So now they got, I mean, that was just a horrible PR move. It's, I mean, the reports are all saying, and I believe Free Palestine and Emma Watson are still trending on Twitter. People came to her defense by and large. I mean, many people were saying, as they say here, that this diminished attention to real cases of anti-Semitism, which of course it does. Lately, there have been more, suspicious reports about, this guy got punched in the eye for wearing an IDF shirt, I think in New York or something like that. And these people were all coming out, IDF shirt challenge, hashtag this, and I don't know. I mean, this lady Leah Greenberg is quoted, she's the co-executive director of a group called the Indivisible Project. And she says that Dannon's remarks are, quote, a perfect demonstration of the utterly cynical and bad faith weaponization of anti-Semitism to shut down basic expressions of solidarity with the Palestinian people. And her Watson's Instagram post has 600,000 likes and over 47,000 comments right now.
Yeah. So that is one thing that kind of makes me laugh is sometimes, I think that the people like in the foreign policy establishment or like, the blob in general think that they run social media and everything like that because, when they're picking on antiwar.com or something like that, their followers outnumber. But, Harry Potter is another level, and Emma Watson has a very like loyal following. And so, in this case, it may be more that, the reaction is in the overreaction, right? And that's where like all the power will be, is if they go too hard on Emma Watson here and her supporters go, I'm going to read about this a little bit or something, where if they had said nothing because she really didn't say that much of anything anyways, then nothing happens. Nobody cares. But it's all the value is in the Israeli lobby's reaction, and so maybe this is actually a little bit of a good sign and not bad news to see this happen.
Yeah, and I'll just point out. I mean, I haven't. As far as just to clarify on that story about the guy who got punched with the IDF shirt, it was just funny because a lot of, like, to your point, like Zionists on Twitter were coming out and saying like, how dare, like, we're being forced to denounce our only means of defending ourselves. I forget what this woman's name is, Eve Barlow or something like that. She said, we have to denounce, we're being told to denounce our only means of self-defense in order to just be, free from hate crimes, something like that. And it's much more nuanced than that. If you're wearing the IDF shirt, a lot of people think it's like totally okay to punch Nazis. Like that was a very common thing for a while. And especially from neoliberals, like that was kind of the attitude. And I don't necessarily support that. I mean, it depends on what the Nazi is doing. I mean, we're libertarians, so it's the non-aggression principle. But wearing a shirt sporting like, basically proudly brandishing the insignias and logos of an apartheid regime occupation force is provocative in and of itself. So it might not warrant it certainly doesn't warrant just being punched. But there's a lot of nuance involved in that conversation.
Right. Like if somebody wearing like, a Nazi uniform walked into like a temple or something like that.
Exactly.
And somebody punched them in the face and I was on that jury. Sorry, Nazi, but you know what I mean? Like you're obviously going there to try to like instill fear in them. And so the fact that you got punched in the face and they rejected like your effort to intimidate them is fine with me. And so, what, there are different limits to that. Although I guess probably wearing an IDF shirt in public, I don't know if that reaches that level, especially like when you have, and I mean, this is unfortunate and a real problem in our culture, but like, people like Gal Gadot is, super popular. She's Wonder Woman or I don't know. I lose track of all these things. Anyways, but since she was a part of the IDF and everything, I don't know, I could just see random people wearing like IDF shirts and really not understanding where there really can't be like a misunderstanding. Like if you're like wearing like some Nazi, like maybe if you're from a different country or something like that, I'll feel bad. I don't know, maybe in different areas of the world, like they mock Nazis rather than, treat them like Voldemort or something, like, we don't say the name, where other people like it may be more of like you treat Hitler like the US did in like the 1950s where like, they had him like doing stupid dances on the screen and stuff like that and all those old movies.
Even during the Third Reich's reign, you had the Three Stooges and stuff like that, Charlie Chaplin and
that's what I'm thinking of. You're right. It was during the war. But anyway, like, so like if other people mock then, but generally speaking, I don't know, punching people in the IDF shirt, if that, quite gets to that level. But, it's not also probably something provocative that most people understand what they're doing. Anyways, Connor, what else do we got going on here?
Yeah, so Yair Lapid is very concerned about stuff like this. He just had a Zoom meeting with Israeli journalists talking about how he's very concerned that in 2022 Israel is going to, what did he call it? He says it's a radioactive venomous threat or a venomous debate. He says, we think in the coming year there will be a debate that is unprecedented in its venom and its radioactivity around the words, quote, Israel is an apartheid state. In 2022, it will be a tangible threat. And so he specifically points, the Israelis are specifically pointing to probes by the International Criminal Court into Israeli war crimes, the UN Human Rights Council's efforts they're going to establish a commission inquiry into Israel's treatment of the Palestinians. The Human Rights Council as well is going to investigate Operation Guardian of the Walls, which we covered extensively on this show back in May when the Israelis bombed well, I mean, it was a bunch of different things. I mean, honestly, it was the raids on the Al-Aqsa Mosque where they were, firing rubber-coated bullets at people's eyes and faces and throwing sound bombs and stun grenades and
Right.
attacking people.
Yeah, and they attempted to seize homes in Sheikh
Sheikh Jarrah.
Jarrah, and along with then everything that happened in and around Gaza, including ramping up the blockade, restrictions on fishing, and everything else. Everybody knows about the bombing campaign and everything like that, but there are also other restrictions that are worth mentioning.
For sure, and so Guardian of the Walls is specifically referring to the military operation in Gaza. They killed somewhere around 250 Palestinians, maybe more, and about approximately 60 children, and just destroyed, I believe, tens of thousands of homes. And homes are still collapsing to this day, as you reported on a recent show. And so Yair Lapid says, he goes, the Commission of Inquiry into Guardian of the Walls is unprecedented because it doesn't have a time limit. It doesn't have a limit of scope, and it is well funded with many people working on it. And building on the conversation with the whole Ben and Jerry's scandal again about the thing with Emma Watson, the Israelis really have a problem here because they're, the way they treat Palestinians is essentially indefensible. And so their reaction to baselessly throw out accusations of anti-Semitism against anybody who, either wants to peacefully boycott or not do business under the apartheid regime in the occupied territories, or just say that they express solidarity with the occupied Palestinians. They, I don't know what their plans are. They're probably trying to get these journalists to ramp up the Hasbara. There's a good article I recommend people read about this at Mondo Weiss right now. But it's just, I mean, they always end up sort of doubling down and exposing themselves even further, because there's a lot of people who probably wouldn't have known. They probably would have assumed BDS is just, a bunch of whatever. Maybe like if you're a Republican, you think, oh, these are pansy liberals who like Bernie Sanders and they don't like Israel. What are you going to do? But they made a whole thing of, now everybody knows, or at least a lot of people know about these BDS laws that, that they've lobbied, 30 different states or something like that to put these different anti-BDS laws on the books, so that they can, defund the pensions of all these different, companies that are, like Unilever, I believe, in various states. And I mean, I haven't been following it as closely, but I know DeSantis has been very hawkish on this.
Florida, New York, Illinois, New Jersey, Texas, I believe Arizona. I've covered them all on the show, so people have been listening, but I can't recall them all from memory. But there's been several, and I think there's a few more that I left off of that list where, the laws vary. Some of the laws require the state legislator to take the action, or some of them it's more of like a governor appointment, or just like a state employee who holds some random office, somehow got that job, who gets to decide. And then in other cases, it's like the governor or whoever's in charge of the state gets to make that decision. But yeah, it's so much hostility towards people who support the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, where most of the people that really all they're focused on is the boycott and the divestment. I rarely hear anybody advocate for sanctions against Israel, and to the extent that they do, it's more ceremonial in like this is what helped to bring down the apartheid South Africa regime, and to I think draw parallels to that movement. But really, what they're talking about is boycott and divesting from Israel, and sanctions is a bad word sometimes, when in reality you could just talk about shutting off U.S. funding for the Israeli government. That would be a significant blow. They get a lot of money from the U.S., $4+ billion a year.
Well, that's the whole thing. That's what's ironic about it. If you look at and even to your point about the South African situation, you can look up videos of rock stars and musicians holding massive concerts in the late 80s. American musicians like Steven Van Zandt of the Bruce Springsteen group and Chrissie Hynde from the Pretenders holding these big concerts where I think Steven Van Zandt, I've seen this before. He has a song, it's called the Sanctions Song, and the chorus is like, let's tighten up those sanctions. So yeah, I mean, this is it's not like, and as you said, it's more about, they say that you're delegitimizing the Israeli state. And that's the issue with the boycott and the divestment. And the last thing on that I was just going to say is that sorry, man, I just lost my train of thought there for a second.
That's all right. We could probably move on, and I want to ask you about this. That apparently Israel is going to form the U.S. on all deals involving China, and then if those deals are unacceptable to the U.S., Israel will look to alter them. And I don't know. I guess this is interesting because it seems like even the UAE butt the U.S. a little bit on this, but Israel is saying that no, we're full on board, and any American discomfort, even if it results from what seems to me at some points to be just essentially kind of racism, like you don't like China and Chinese people, and so anywhere you see Chinese business, that has to be something evil and nefarious going on. And so what's going on here, Connor?
Sure. Oh, and I was just going to say before I forget, just the point about the BDS thing is I remember around the time of shortly after Operation Guardian the Walls, I believe Abby Martin was on Joe Rogan's podcast, and Rogan was completely flabbergasted learning about the anti-BDS laws on the books in U.S. states and couldn't believe it, and was like, how is this not front page news about foreign interference in our democracy and this kind of thing? And that's a huge scandal. I mean, it's Russiagate and all this kind of stuff is obviously fake, but the truth is that there is, as we've discussed recently, real intervention going on from these other allied states who want to curry more favor and get more aid and from the empire, all these satellites. But yeah, as far as China, so again, just like with the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And actually, this has been going on with Israel for a minute. Pompeo, I believe it was in March of 2019, was suggesting because of, Israel was doing business with Huawei. I mean, this was like an empty threat at the same time. But Pompeo was saying things like, we'll cut intelligence and military ties with Israel if they continue to do business like this with China. And as Dave points out, to your point, it is very bizarre when you consider that China is our greatest trading partner, that we're going around and demanding all these other states limit or end trade with China. So China has put a lot of money into Israel for the Belt and Road Initiative. They have all kinds of infrastructure projects that they're working on, transport, different ports, as well as, water infrastructure and things like this. And so the Biden administration has been continually warning them to stop this. I believe in August, Bill Burns met with Naftali Bennett. So the CIA director met with the Israeli prime minister and specifically told him, it sounds like, to stop or was talking to him about Chinese involvement in the Tel Aviv metro. And so the U.S. is suggesting that they need to stop doing this business. And so the Israelis, I guess, have said to the Americans, well, do you have any, do you have any alternatives? Do you have any infrastructure investments from U.S. companies? But the Americans have not offered anything as of yet. the report I have from Middle East Eye that you have up there now also indicates that Sullivan, we reported on his meetings with Israeli officials last month, that this was discussed there as well. And apparently he was talking to Yair Lapid about it, the foreign minister of Israel. And this was also a conversation that was held in a previous meeting in Washington. So the Israelis are trying to sort of figure out, like, their position here, like, because it seems like the quote is an official, or what did they say? It's sources told Haaretz in this report that they're still taking a, quote, business as usual approach with China, but they are trying to, like, find some sort of middle ground. They want to satisfy these U.S. demands. It's kind of an interesting situation there. And previously, the Israelis, it seemed to me, were just kind of flouting the Americans' wishes, because shortly after that whole thing with Bennett, or around the same time, I remember reading about China opening up, I think it was just another private port in Israel. So let's see. So they also are very concerned about, as I said earlier, Chinese investments in Israel's tech industry as well. So now Israel is saying that they're open to promoting joint initiatives with the UAE and with India, which is also interesting because I think Israel is keen to do more business with the UAE, especially since they panicked so visibly and noticeably after there was these peaceful sort of diplomatic interactions. I believe Mohammed bin Zayed's brother, the top national security advisor, I'm blanking on his full name, but he went to Tehran and expressed essentially that they want to build close ties with Iran and develop all kinds of economic ties and overcome any obstacles that might get in the way, and different sectors that they'd like to work on. And then very soon the Israelis said, we're keeping an eye on this Abu Dhabi Tehran axis. And the Americans sent, I believe, a delegation, was it from the Treasury Department over there, to tighten up sanctions and talk about how UAE banks are in violation of the maximum pressure campaign on Iran. And then the Israelis, specifically Bennett, went over there. And that kind of a visit, that high level of a visit, had never happened before between Israel and the UAE. And he went down there and he specifically talked about how he wants Israel to be doing business with the UAE on the same sort of in the same sectors that the Emiratis and the Iranians were discussing cooperating in. So, I mean, that was very transparent. And then, of course, there's also been a lot of talk from the China hawks about how they would like to see India sort of replace China economically in many ways, because there is this sort of push to isolate China, of course, in this sort of new Cold War paradigm. But they do point out here in the report that Israeli, according to the World Bank, in 2019, Israeli exports to China totaled more than $4 billion. And in the same year, their imports from China exceeded $10 billion. So there's quite a bit of money moving around. And as they mentioned here, that China is very keen on building stronger ties, expanding, as I've noted before, the oil, their oil interests in Iran, and they have infrastructure projects ongoing in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. But yeah, so it's very interesting, because as America sort of it's interpreted widely that they're sort of inching away, sometimes faster, sometimes slower, from the region. I mean, it's inevitable that Russia and China are getting more and more involved economically, especially, and but they can't help them. I don't know what they're going to do at some point, because now the UAE did halt their Chinese construction on that port, because the Americans said that they had intelligence that it was like a military installation, or they were sort of militarizing it. So things get a little bit more complicated. But I don't think they can keep that up. I think there's a lot of interest in getting China involved there. And of course, as Scott Horton will point out, a big part of our involvement in the Middle East so much in the first place was to be able to cut off states like Russia and China from Middle Eastern oil in the event of a war. And we are preparing for war with China, whether it's coming or not. That is what's going on. That's the policy.
And then I'll mention quickly, just between the UAE and Israel, there's a report that there's a contract, an Israeli, I believe, aerospace company to sell the UAE what they're calling like defensive technology for their fleet of like cargo Airbuses. I think they're military planes and everything, but it just kind of interesting. But there's here a deal between the U.S. and Israel for helicopters and refueling planes. What's going on with this, Connor?
Yeah, so the Israelis last Thursday signed a deal for about $3.1 billion. They're buying 12 Lockheed Martin heavy transport helicopters and 2 Boeing KC-46 refueling planes from the U.S. Now, that $3.1 billion is American taxpayer money. This comes out of our military aid to Israel. And they're claiming that the helicopters are necessary to replace the Sikorsky CH-53 Sea Stallion helicopters that Israel's been using since the late 60s. Now, the agreement, according to the Israeli Defense Ministry, gives them the option to purchase 6 additional helicopters. But, again, the first helicopters aren't due to arrive until 2026. And I noted that it was interesting that they're buying 2 of those same refueling planes we were talking about, that report in the New York Times a few weeks ago that said that, around the time the Israeli defense officials who were talking about how they were ready to attack Iran and preparing for it and, we'll do it. They all started walking back this kind of rhetoric saying, we don't have, to be honest, we don't have the refueling tankers, we don't have the bunker buster bombs, and we don't have planes that are big enough or capable of carrying the bunker buster bombs. So, but those are 2 of those same planes. Now, it doesn't indicate exactly when those planes will be arriving, but we do know that when Gantz, the defense minister, Benny Gantz, went over to Washington last month to meet with Lloyd Austin, he requested 8 of these Boeing KC-46 refueling planes, and they were told that they won't be ready. They're on back order. They won't be ready until 2024. So it's not exactly clear to me when all this is going to be coming, but the defense ministry said that the deal is part of a wider upgrade of Israel's Air Force capabilities, goes along with the procurement of new F-35 aircraft and, quote, advanced air munition, air defense systems, new marine and land platforms, as well as cyber systems, the defense ministry said. And, of course, it's noted in the report that as they've been talking up, these tanker aircraft enable them to do, long-range attacks implicitly that is, aimed at Iran, most likely. So, and this comes on the heels of another big bombing at the Latakia port in Syria, where there's reports now I've seen of potentially 10 dead. And it's kind of going back and forth. I don't know what the latest is, but they claim that the shipping containers that they hit, at first it was saying there was food and medicine burned inside. And now I'm seeing that it's a lot of they're saying it's car parts. But initially, anyway, the reports were coming out saying that a residential area had been hit, I think even a hospital, and that they were once again waiting until a Russian plane was flying into the Russian base nearby, which they're supposed to stay away from. But the reason they do that is so the Syrian air defenses, the Syrians are reluctant to turn them on for fear of hitting the Russians, because that's happened in the past. Yep. And so, just more provocations, and I think the Russians really can't do much about it, and they kind of talk it up like, we're very upset about this, but nothing ever really changes.
Yep. And I think the hospital, my understanding is it was nearby the strike and it caught fire somehow. I'm not sure how serious, like, maybe the dumpster out back caught fire and now the windows like burned out, or maybe like entire like 4 or 5 rooms got like burned or something like that in the process. But let's see, Israel's also bombing Gaza. I had mentioned the possibility of this on maybe Sunday's show. I had talked about that. I was concerned that there was an exchange of gunfire along the border between Gaza and Israel, that a Israeli defense contractor who was doing some maintenance work on I don't know what was hit and lightly injured by gunfire. In response, Israel fired, I believe, a tank or some kind of artillery and injured what people in Gaza identified as 3 Palestinian farmers. And then from there, I believe Gaza fired 2 rockets that landed in the sea, but now we have Israel bombing Gaza, so this seems to be a possible escalation.
Yeah, so first of all, as the AP notes here, that it's very possible that those rockets weren't meant to hit Israel in the first place. They could have been test firing. They often test fire and fire into the Mediterranean Sea. But and of course, no casualties were reported from those rocket attacks. So then the Israeli military launched air strikes against what they claimed are like militant targets in Gaza. It's the usual thing you'll hear when they bomb Gaza. They go, it's a rocket manufacturing facility and a military post for Hamas. But what we actually have is video footage from Khan Yunis in the southern Gaza Strip, where it shows 3 huge explosions. And as they say here, fighter jets can be heard flying overhead. Although this report says that there's been no immediate confirmation on possible casualties in this attack either. They also point out that tensions were running high because even though Islamic Jihad has not said that this the previously mentioned prisoner on the hunger strike was a member of their group, they did say that if he's killed, we'll treat it as an assassination by the enemy, and that there would be they would respond accordingly, militarily. And so this was kind of, they were rallying support for this man in the West Bank and Gaza. And so this was just at least partially that was what was going on here. You had tensions running high. But again, tensions are always running high if you're caged essentially in an open air prison camp under blockade, and the Israelis, bomb Gaza on a semi-regular basis. And of course, there's been more and more, especially that's another thing that they're very concerned about, which was really became very obvious that in the past they've tried to separate the Palestinians in places, like Gaza, Israel proper, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. And what's happened is you're seeing that now an attack on Palestinians in East Jerusalem, like in Sheikh Jarrah, you get a reaction from the Gazans. You get Palestinian Arabs who live in Israel proper going on, strike and different things like this, and protests in the West Bank as a result of this. So the long-term strategy has not worked, this sort of divide and conquer strategy. So, that's all, of course, a part of this. But as of now, I haven't heard on any casualties or to the extent the damage is in these strikes.
All right, Connor. Let's see. What else do we have here? Can we move on and talk about any news we have on the Iran talks and potential
Sure.
anything going on? It sounds kind of like good news as long as you don't talk to the Americans. Then it doesn't sound like great news. But Iran saying what the West has new realism at talks. That sounds like good news.
Yeah. It's based off of we had this conversation last week. Essentially what my interpretation of things that was going on was that the Iranians really had gained the upper hand in the negotiations by sticking to their guns and remaining steadfast and pushing against the pressure from the Europeans and the Americans and the Israelis. And they said, no, we're demanding sanctions relief, and we're going to negotiate these draft proposals we've put forward. Those previous draft agreements that you had with Rouhani notwithstanding, those were full of brackets and not officially anything. So and then ultimately in the 7th round, we're in the 8th round now. They paused for New Year's and then restarted on January 3rd. Ironically, that's the anniversary of Soleimani's assassination, the general. So the 8th round of talks is picking up. Basically, it's after the pivotal 7th round where they decided that actually, we're going to negotiate on the basis of these new terms put forward by the Iranians, which essentially, they're demanding a full implementation of the JCPOA and comprehensive sanctions relief. They also want guarantees from the Americans that they won't leave the deal again, and I believe that they're looking for some sort of a verification period to guarantee sanctions relief before they. I think that's very smart, actually, in order to so that they don't cede their leverage too soon, which would be frankly disastrous from their perspective. So we had the Iranians coming out, and so this is Saeed Khatibzadeh, the foreign ministry spokesman. He says, we sense a retreat, or rather realism, from the Western parties in the Vienna negotiations, that there can be no demands beyond the nuclear accord. He said and then he kind of turned the State Department's rhetoric back around on them, and he goes, it's still too soon to judge if the United States and the European countries have drawn up a real agenda to commit to lifting sanctions. Because, of course, when they were expressing their optimism earlier, you had Ned Price, may have been some other officials as well, maybe Malley or Blinken, but I'm sure it was Ned Price actually coming out and going, it's still too early to tell if they're taking a constructive approach and this kind of thing. So Now, before that, I'll also say that Ali Bagheri Khani, the lead negotiator, said that. Now, as I said, in the seventh round, they decided that because they said to the Europeans, you put forward your own proposals, and then we'll discuss those. Like, we're glad to look at your proposals, but you haven't put anything forward. It's been weeks now. So ultimately, they agreed to the Iranians' terms. They put forward a draft proposal on sanctions relief, and then also on their obligations to walk back the expansion and advancement of the nuclear program outside the written confines of the deal. They're still in the deal, of course. But anyway, they are saying now, that, the conversation, they were also complaining they weren't focused enough on sanctions relief. They say it is now. He says some written changes on the lifting of sanctions were established between the two parties, and relative satisfactory progress has been made over the first days of the eighth round of negotiations. He says the discussions focused mainly on the lifting of sanctions. We hope that after a few days of pause, more serious work will continue on the question of lifting sanctions. So those are the talks that have resumed at this point since yesterday. At the same time, Yair Lapid, the Israeli foreign minister, has come out and he's talking about attacking Iran again. And he's even saying more provocative things like we have capabilities that the experts of the world can't even imagine. And we may just go ahead and attack Iran without even warning the U.S. about it in advance. I find that hard to believe. At the same time, if they get really desperate, because they're afraid about losing their hegemony in the region, it's very possible they could do that. At the same time, he still said that he conceded that the wrong deal hasn't been made yet. So it's interesting. As we said last week, we have Isaac Herzog, the president, and even Bennett coming out and saying things like "deal or no deal, Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon," and which is, as stupid as this idea of them searching for, seeking nuclear weapons is. It's baseless. The fact that the Israelis are kind of stepping down, that is a step down, this kind of deal or no deal. I would accept a good deal, not a bad deal. Like this is actually a concession, even though it's disguised as more bluster. So, and then Ned Price came out today, I believe, or maybe it was yesterday, but I read the report from Dave DeCamp over at antiwar.com today that that Price came out, the State Department spokesman, and he said modest progress is being made. And he goes, the discussions are centering on sanctions relief. So again, that's another sign that what we said last week is turning out to be correct, that the Iranians are in fact gaining the advantage here in the talks. And the Americans and the Russians, there's not much detail on it, but they recently had a discussion. Ulanov, the lead negotiator there from Russia in Vienna, met with Robert Malley, the UN envoy, and they put out kind of perfunctory statements about it. Although I think the Russians said it was a constructive conversation. So, and they support Iran's position. So that could also be another good sign.
Yeah, and so, Connor, before we move on and start talking about some other stuff, including Korea and some African countries, I did want to mention that on the anniversary, the second anniversary of the assassination of the now deceased Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, there were 3 events in the Middle East that I guess are being attributed to Iran, although I haven't seen like a big statement or the U.S. government make a big deal out of it yet. So interesting, the timing of this with Iran talks and everything, but also not surprising. Soleimani was a huge figure in the Middle East, and so, but the 3 events were 2 drones being fired, and now on 2 separate occasions. The first set of 2 drones being fired at the Baghdad airport. Apparently, they report that one of those drones had Soleimani's revenge on the wings of it. Of course, I believe the U.S. said in response to this, like, it's irresponsible to carry out an attack on a structure like the Baghdad airport, which is the ultimate hypocrisy, because that is, of course, where Soleimani was killed. And also to mention here, along with al-Mohandes, who was the leader of the Popular Mobilization Forces and the Shia militias in Iraq, and for at least Iraq, not the Middle East at large, the loss of Mohandes may have been bigger to the Shia militias. And, that's just important to note that, there's more tied there. But also there were 2 drones fired at a U.S. base west of Baghdad. All the drones were intercepted. Nothing got anywhere near anything. Off the coast of Yemen, and I saw conflicting reports. Some people report this happened in the Red Sea, which would make more sense. Others reported it happened off the island of Skorhoda, which would be a little bit different because this is out in the Gulf of Aden, a little bit further from Houthi territory. But apparently there was a UAE ship that was seized. The Saudi coalition has claimed that there's medical supplies on the ship, and the Houthis claim they stole weapons. Who knows what the truth is? It could even be both. You know why I mean? There could be medical supplies and weapons on the ship, for all I know. And interesting there. And then the last act was the hacking of the Jerusalem Post's page. Only the website, only the front page. It said something about Soleimani on it. After it was hacked. I guess it's easy to attribute all these ads to Iran. Although, if you look at Iraq, the Shia militias could have done it because they're upset not only about Soleimani, but al-Mohandes, and that wouldn't be a huge surprise. Also, the Shia militias in Iraq act well outside of Iranian influence frequently, including with the assassination or the recent assassination attempt on the president, which Iran condemned, and the Iranian militia or the Iraqi militia seemed okay with it. The seizing the boat, the UAE boat, the Houthis aren't that connected to Iran, and probably would have had the smallest connection to Soleimani of any of the groups in the Middle East. So kind of interesting that the Houthis would take part. The Houthis do carry out operations against Iran. Not against Iran, against the UAE and the Saudi coalition. But that would be an awful strange coincidence. And so maybe the Iranians helped to provide intelligence or something there to the Houthis to seize the ship, but unclear of what role Iran had. And then the hacking of the website, it could have been done by literally anyone. And so while I'm not saying that it wasn't the Iranians who did it, without proof, I see, no reason to believe it. And so, with all the circumstances, it does seem like, this could have been acted by Iran. The Iranians, on the more just public relations level, were putting out that they're very upset about it and that they want Donald Trump to be held responsible for the assassination, which of course is a non-starter ask. You know what I mean? Like, Bill Clinton's ever going to be held, responsible for starving Iraqis to death or anything. Like, they could say it, but they have to know it's not going to happen. So anyways, those are some things. The last thing I'll mention on Israel, Connor, is that apparently Poland now is caught up in the NSO group scandal and was spying on at least 3 dissidents. This article from Middle East Eye also interestingly lays out that in 5 countries, including Rwanda, Hungary, Azerbaijan, and then Poland, the sale of the Pegasus spyware to those countries coincided with visits from Benjamin Netanyahu. So it's interesting. Maybe he was just like slinging this stuff for the NSO group. Connor, anything else on Israel before we move on here?
I'll just add that I think Pompeo is still crazy enough to run for president. There's clips going around of him on Hannity last night repeating the lie that Soleimani was preparing an attack on Americans and we thwarted it, and isn't this great? And Hannity called it one of the most daring and impressive military maneuvers of our lifetime, something like that. Yeah, and then Pompeo said. He said that, and he's talking up what a hero he is and Trump was, and how he says we're faced by Iran's threat to the U.S. at this point. He goes, it's unprecedented, and all this kind of thing about, he goes, their capabilities with their terrorist proxies and the leading state sponsor of terror. And then I saw Dave DeCamp ran on Twitter today. Pompeo put out a tweet saying, the most important job of the Secretary of State, or something like this. If I'm paraphrasing it slightly off, please correct me, anybody. But he does say something like my most important job as Secretary of State is to stand with Israel, our greatest ally. So, what constituency he's playing to.
Right. And just real quick, I read the Hill article had the like 10 most likely Republicans to run for president in 2024. It was Trump, Nikki Haley, Mike Pence, Mike Pompeo, Chris Christie, Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, and like just the list of absolute lunatics. It scared the hell out of me. But let's talk about Korea here, Connor, because this really hasn't gotten really any attention in the U.S. media throughout Biden's presidency, which is really unfortunate because, as I've been yelling about on the show for like the past 4 or 5 years and nobody's bothered to listen, is that there was a real president in South Korea who was willing to do what needed to be done to make a deal with the North Koreans and really was dedicated to trying to get that done, and essentially had no American partner. And the way that it words as South Korea being a proxy of the United States. If the United States says we're not going to lift sanctions to allow the South Koreans to send delegations to North Korea, then, deals can't get done. And of course, the U.S. is a party to the Korean War, which is still, only solved by armistice. So for it to end, the U.S. would have to sign on for it. Also, as North Korea regularly points out, one of their biggest issues is the hostile American policy. And so earlier this week on the show, Connor, I was mentioning that there was this deal that was being pushed by Moon Jae-in, and he said that he had come to an in principle agreement with North Korea and China to declare a formal end to the Korean War. Sounded like good news, but I have figured that in principle was doing a hell of a lot of work in this statement, and so there wasn't a real reason to be optimistic. Then we had the South Korean top diplomat saying that there was an effectively that South Korea had reached an agreement with the United States on a draft declaration that would formally end the Korean War. Sounds positive. Again, I think in this statement, effectively is doing a lot of work, and that the South Koreans, as announced even by the president, Moon Jae-in, are making a real push before Moon Jae-in leaves office. This, I think, spring. I think March is when the term ends. It might be February. But trying to get something done, trying to start a peace process, and hopefully one that can't be undone before he leaves office. And as much as I would love to see this happen, Connor, I'm still not optimistic, but my understanding is that his party isn't doing particularly poorly in the polls. Not that I think has an opportunity to be president again by South Korean law, but so maybe if he could start a process, then something could help to materialize. And it's just going to depend on a very eager and willing partner in the United States to do that. But that really doesn't describe the Biden administration on diplomacy, from what we've seen with Iran talks and everything like that. So I'm still not hopeful, but it is interesting, and all credit to Moon Jae-in for trying to do something. Now, South Korea under Moon Jae-in isn't the perfect state, and they engage in militarism and buy and show off their new fighter planes and everything like that. But at the same time, I think the best chance for like a real deal to get done in Korea is about to pass us with Moon Jae-in, leaving office in the next couple of months.
I know you and Will have talked about the opportunity that and previously the Olympics has been used as a way for the Koreans to come together and represent the peninsula in a unified way. Do you think there's any chance that next month, depending on whether his term ends in February or March, if they could do something like that? And also, do you think the Americans are influencing the election to try and get I don't know, a more militarist successor?
So on the election, I have no idea. I really don't know South Korean politics that well. On the Olympics issue, I haven't heard any talk about it, so my assumption would be no. For probably multiple reasons, not just it probably lost its novelty after doing it the first time and it not being in South Korea, but also just with COVID and stuff, that may be a harder thing to try to set up. I'm not sure what the Chinese Olympic rules are around COVID, but I could see that, that being a little bit of a barrier to trying to do this at the last minute. So That's what I had on Korea, Connor. Next I got some news on Sudan, where protests have continued. And last time I talked about Sudan on the show, Connor, the Prime Minister Hamdok was reinstated to his post after being overthrown by a military coup near the end of October. It took about an entire month of protests. I think around November 22nd, he was reinstated. But once he was reinstated, there was a feeling that he really didn't have power. And in fact, some of the protesters were upset with the former prime minister for accepting the deal that he did, feeling like it gave the military too much control. And so that's that kind of catches us up to the news I'm talking about today. The first story I have is from Reuters. Exclusive: Sudan cut off from 650 million of international funding after coup. And this is $500 million from the World Bank and $150 million from the IMF that isn't going to go to Sudan as scheduled, on top of the aid coming from the U.S. Now, this could be a problem for Sudan, and the leadership there, Connor, has said that it's going to create an economic problem. However, this move does have the support, at least of some of the protesters in Sudan. And so that's, kind of interesting. And it may just be a small section of the protesters, but it does seem to be the same protest movement that, got Hamdok reinstated. So, very interesting how, this is kind of playing out in the politics here. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
No, I'm learning as I go. I need to catch up more on what's been going on in Sudan.
All right. So then the protests really escalated around the end of December. And at December 20th, we had one protester killed, as they were demanding the military leadership of the country take a bad seat. And I think they want this guy Al Fatah to actually, resign from his post, and he's like the main top military guy at this point. Now, then a few days later, I think this is like right about New Year's Eve, New Year's Day, there was a situation in Sudan where that morning the military had cut the internet and had started firing tear gas at the protesters. And this seemed like it was likely going to lead to an increase of violence, and then there was at least 5 people killed that day. So the death toll since the initial military coup, now in October 25th, I think is approaching 60 people, with again about 60 or 6 in the past couple of weeks. So very interesting, a lot going on with all of this, Connor. But yeah, I guess then after those 5 protesters are killed, the Prime Minister Hamdok again resigns, and the U.S. put out a statement saying that the U.S. was prepared to respond to Sudan's deadly crackdown against pro-democracy protesters. And so, not sure if the U.S. is actually going to intervene here, but it does seem that this has the attention of the State Department, although more protesters are killed, in several places around the world. So I'm not sure why the U.S. is making a special case of this. Last story on Sudan is this actually happened towards the beginning of December and seems to be a relatively separate issue than what's going on in the capital, protesting and everything like that. But there was some tribal fighting in Western Darfur that left about 100 people dead over the course of 4 days. So that is what I have on Ethiopia or Sudan. And next up, I will move on and talk about Ethiopia, where I recently had, what was it? Probably Conflicts of Interest 201 was Thedros Frinka Mariam, who is an Ethiopian who came on the show and answered my questions about Ethiopia. So if you want like a deeper dive on it, check out that show. But the Tigrayan forces, or the TPLF, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, had advanced pretty seriously into territory outside of Tigray, Ethiopia. And so they have made some battle success, but that has been turned back really since November, but throughout the month of December. And this has led to the Tigrayan forces announcing an official retreat out of all the territory that isn't Tigrayan in northern Ethiopia. And so it seems that the government had made some success. Now, this was portrayed by the Tigrayans as a move to open up the possibility for a ceasefire, although I'm somewhat skeptical, Connor, that the real purpose of this move was to that they were losing, and so by withdrawing a little bit when you had already lost kind of creates a propaganda narrative to have demand the ceasefire or something like that. So the government, a couple days after that, said the fighting was still ongoing and that the Tigrayans hadn't pulled back. But then on December 24th, the Ethiopian government announced that they were stopping their advance and would not go further into Tigray. And so it does seem that they have reached a place in Ethiopia, at least over the past 10 days or so, where the fighting has somewhat subsided, at least on the ground level. It's a little bit more unclear to me how much of a drone war the Ethiopian government is waging, and that does seem to be what has turned the battle so far. This report for New York Times: foreign drones tipped the balance in Ethiopia's civil war. And this isn't just a hypothesis from the New York Times. If you listen to Horton's interview with the war nerd, he kind of lays out the impact that the drones were having in Ethiopia as well. And so this article lays out that it appears that Ethiopia has gotten drones from the UAE, Turkey, and Iran over the past few months, and these have helped to tip the balance of the war in Ethiopia's favor. In this article, I think they mention one particular strike that's believed to kill 18 civilians and injure a bunch of other civilians. But not a whole lot of reporting going on that in detail. That's really good, well researched. Same thing in general with the alleged war crimes in Ethiopia and stuff like that, Connor, where we have reporting saying it's happening, but not a lot of evidence, and who knows who's actually killing who and for what purposes. So a lot of question marks in Ethiopia, as always, while I'm trying to report on it. But it does seem that the Ethiopian army has pushed the TPLF back at least to Tigray, and for now that's created a lull or a pause in the ground fighting. Again, I can't and don't want to say much other than that and speculate. Last thing on Ethiopia is that Ethiopia, along with Mali and Guinea, were expelled from the African Growth and Opportunities Act. And this is a particular program that African countries could be involved in that allows them access to, I think, more tax-free goods from the U.S. And so this could apparently, according to this CNN article, cost the Ethiopian government like hundreds of millions of dollars in business a year. And so, even if the Ethiopian government is committing war crimes and things like that, Connor, it's not exactly clear to me that this would be, cutting off them out of this program is going to help the people of Ethiopia in any way. And so, and I do think the Ethiopian government, along with probably the Malayan government at least, is committing war crimes. So, yeah, they're kicked out of that program. And do you have anything else on Ethiopia, Connor?
No, but I mean, that's obviously they're clearly that's politically motivated, because obviously we've just been covering war crimes committed by U.S. allies, and obviously we have trying to increase business with those states.
Yeah, absolutely. And CNN kind of wrote that article bragging how it was their reporting that got Ethiopia kicked out of that program. And if you really want to do some good reporting, you get Saudi Arabia kicked out of some American arms sales for butchering journalists and slaughtering Yemeni children. But let's move on next to the Congo, where I think it was towards the end of November that the Ugandan army invaded with a force of, at least announced by the governments, about 1,400 troops into the eastern Congo to help the government fight against the ADF, the Allied Democratic Forces. And the government has been waging a campaign against the ADF for years and years. They announced like a new campaign, I think in 2018 or 2019, and it's only increased the violence. The more the government fights, it seems the more the ADF kills, and they do slaughter civilians. It's an absolutely brutal and disgusting group, and so as far as reporting on the fighting goes, it's actually pretty scarce, at least in English, reporting. If there's a lot of reporting going on in local languages or stuff, I'm just unaware of it. But the Congolese forces, along with the Ugandan forces, say they've recently captured 35 members of the ADF. Probably going to be treated really horrifically, torture, stuff like that going on. These are governments and forces known to carry out war crimes and things like that. But they're not reporting on like who else is dying and who else is being killed. So lots of question marks, Connor, along with what's happening in that invasion. But it does seem like there's at least some level of fighting going on. But my guess is that it's higher than we actually know, because the fighting has created a protest movement that actually wound up with 2 civilians being killed, and a police officer as well in Congo. And the protesters are claiming that there are also Rwandan forces in the Congo, and that they're supporting, which wouldn't be a huge surprise, because the Rwandan forces have a deep partnership with the US, and the US uses Rwandan forces as like a proxy force in Africa's Great Lakes region. There's a big press release from the Department of State from September, but just bragging about all the deep ties between the US and the Rwandan military. So I want to point that out. Also, along with training the Rwandans, part of that partnership is training the Ugandan army as well. And so they all train together. So it wouldn't be a surprise if, these two forces trained by the US are committing war crimes right now in the Congo. There was a suicide bomber in the eastern Congo, and one of the reasons that this was noteworthy, Connor, was that 5 people were killed, and it was the first suicide bombing in the region. And so there's a real concern in the Congo that these kind of attacks are going to explode in this region. And if we look at the studies and everything on what causes suicide bombing, it's occupation. And so it's likely that the recent invasion of at least Ugandan forces into the Congo are helping to spur these attacks. And then overall in the Congo, just scores of people being killed. This particularly in northeastern Congo. The clashes took place where in separate conflicts, the army battling the ADF, and then also a group called Kodko. And they claim that these groups have various links to the Islamic State, but I haven't seen anything to suggest that they're looking to create an Islamic caliphate in the eastern Congo or anything crazy like that, Connor. If anything, it's just swearing allegiance and a little bit of jihadist branding, and it has nothing really to do with any allegiance to like bin Laden or anything like that.
Weren't there reports last year too of the U.S. sending like special forces there ostensibly to combat the ADF?
I believe they're supposed to be an advising role, but yes.
Got it.
All right, last up today, Connor, is Somalia, where the big news is the Prime Minister of Somalia, who has less power than the president, was either fired or suspended by the president. The president alleges that the Prime Minister is corrupt. I have no idea. They're probably both corrupt, just judging off of government officials and their records, but the U.S. seems to be taking the side of the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister spoke with the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, Mali Fee. And, with the U.S. weighing in and getting involved on one side or the other here, it could, create and turn this into a bigger thing. And of course, Somalia is a country that has an active insurgency. For years, they claimed that they were killing a bunch of Islamic State members there. I always was somewhat skeptical of that, but I haven't heard a lot about the Islamic State in Somalia, but Al Shabaab continues to be active. Recently, they killed 7 people near the capital of Somalia, Mogadishu, and also 6 people in Kenya. And while I don't really like to call like Al Shabaab an international terrorist group, like I don't really think there's a threat to America or even like Europe or anything from Al Shabaab. However, Kenya being a neighboring country that's very involved in Somali politics regularly does get attacked by Al Shabaab, and so in a technical sense, they are an international terrorist group, but barely. Last thing to note on Somalia is that they're I don't know if the U.S. forces are stationed there, but there's about 1,000 U.S. National Guard forces in the Horn of Africa, and they're helping to train forces in Djibouti, Somalia, and Kenya. And, Connor, the U.S. National Guard is being deployed all over. These people are from Connecticut, Colorado, Maine, and Massachusetts. I at least know for a fact that Massachusetts and Vermont, and I know for a fact Vermont as well, has deployed their National Guard to fight or to help in the effort, I guess, against COVID. I don't want to sound too propagandic and slogy there, but that's what they say they're doing, is they're going to help the state deal with the lockdowns and the effects of them for COVID. And so stripping those National Guard forces and having them in the Horn of Africa seems like kind of a bad place for them to be at this time. So I think that's pretty much all I have on Africa, Connor, other than this from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com from quite a bit earlier in the month, December 10th, saying that U.S.-led anti-ISIS coalition shifts focus to Africa. And so as you know, there's less and less ISIS to kill in Iraq and Syria. They're going to find people who are willing to call themselves ISIS in places like the Congo and Mali and Niger, Burkina Faso, all over Africa, Libya, and Algeria even. And with that, they're going to create, more and more like different groups and coalitions, and then this is going to give excuses to carry out airstrikes and military operations in more countries. So a lot going on, in Africa, Connor. I always try my best to report on this stuff, but always want to be careful not to say, like, I know exactly what's going on there, because in so many of these places, the reporting is just so thin. But important stuff to keep up on, especially the American role in all these places, like the Congo, like Sudan. Whose side are we taking in Somalia and Ethiopia as well? And that's why I really try to keep my eye on. So, anything else you got before we wrap up, Connor?
No, I was just gonna say I was just reading the what was that report about Taiwan looking to increase and deepen military cooperation. I think they said something about the National Guard getting involved as well with Taiwan.
I know the Coast Guard is very involved in Taiwan.
For sure.
So it is interesting, how it will work if, wouldn't be surprised if they're going to start sending the National Guard to train in Taiwan. All right, Connor.
Check that. I think I read it this weekend.
Yeah, that's where we'll wrap it up today, Connor. Thanks. Now you're the co-host, so I don't have to thank you for coming on the show anymore. But thanks everybody for listening to our show, and just be sure to share it and support what we're doing either at the Libertarian Institute, antiwar.com, or the show directly by buying your CBD products at Paloma Verde or donating on Patreon, Subscribestar, or through crypto. All the information's in the show notes page. Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks, Connor.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Kyle.